Happy Thanksgiving to my fellow Americans. If you're celebrating this, it may look like getting together with family or friends and having a special meal that involves things like turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie, and is meant as an opportunity to give thanks for what we have in our lives and to celebrate together with family. So this gives me a chance to talk about two things I really enjoy: culture, broadly speaking, and American culture more specifically. So a lot of Americans might think that we don't have a culture, but this is a great example of how we do. A culture is a group of people who share values, beliefs, habits, traditions, and Thanksgiving is a great tradition, a holiday that shows some specific habits that we have and also shows some underlying values that we have. When I talk about culture, I usually talk about two things. The first is visible culture, which is the things that we can see. Things like the foods that we eat and the daily habits that we have, the ways that we interact, things like that. And then invisible culture is the underlying things, the values and the traditions and the belief systems that often sort of drive the way that we interact or the things that we do on a visible level. So in terms of visible culture, we have some very specific kinds of foods that I mentioned that people will often have. And in terms of invisible culture, we have sort of the expectation of what these traditions mean and the value system, which has to do with things like appreciation and generosity to others, giving thanks, often a sense of Christian giving of thanks. And so these are things that are really common in American culture in terms of our invisible culture, our value system. But the thing I really want to talk about is the idea that cultures often have lore associated with them. So I wanted to take a minute and talk about the difference between lore and history. So lore typically is stories that are passed down orally that help a community bond, that tell an origin story, that help them feel connected, and then this lore often leads to a formal tradition, a formal ceremony or rite, and a set of value systems that originate from it. And really, in a certain way, that is the lore of our Thanksgiving. It is a lore that has to do with creating an origin story for our country and creating a sense of where this tradition comes from. Now, I imagine most Americans can tell you the lore of this holiday, that it was after the pilgrims arrived at Plymouth Rock and the local natives showed them some things about how to hunt and fish and grow crops in that area. And in November, after a full bounty, they came together to celebrate in harmony and to give thanks for one another, that the pilgrims thanked the Native Americans for helping them, and that it was a very peaceful kind of experience of camaraderie and generosity. The history, of course, is much more complex. There are historians who can tell this better than me, but briefly, there was a meal between pilgrims and the local Native nation. It was more of a tentative peace agreement than a meal of sharing foods and celebrating generosity and giving. And even if this first meal was a celebration of getting together, we know that later there were many, many atrocities that the colonizers perpetuated against natives. But the lore makes for a great story, of course, and makes for a great foundation for a tradition of getting together, sharing a meal, and celebrating and being thankful for what you have, which is a part of many cultures. There are celebrations of thankfulness and of sharing and of breaking bread together. That is a common thing that brings communities together, that forms the foundation of cultures, that reminds us of what we have in common and how we help one another is bigger than what we can do on our own. So I tell you all of that for a couple of reasons. The first is, as I said at the beginning, as a way to remind us that we do have a culture as Americans. We do have traditions that we share, both small traditions like the way we interact on a regular basis, and big traditions like our holidays, like Thanksgiving. and to remind us that there are visible aspects of culture, like the food and the presentation and the components of Thanksgiving. And then there's invisible culture, which is the lore and the legends that lead to it, and the underlying value systems, like I said, generosity and giving and sharing. And then finally, to suggest that there is or could be a balance that we could consider between understanding the lore and celebrating the outcome of that, which is this lovely opportunity in November to get together with family and friends and to celebrate. I think it's a lovely holiday and so much fun for so many people. And then also to know that lore is not history, that there is something concrete, historically documented, that is different than what we believe is the origin of what happened. That there was a lot of atrocities and continue to be a lot of atrocities perpetuated against Native citizens and against nations. And to recognize that maybe part of moving forward and reconciling healing is to consider things like, what are some of the issues still facing Native nations today? What are some things that we could do to bring awareness to these issues? The fact that many Indigenous women go missing, the fact that there is still a lot of healing that needs to be done for those individuals who were part of the forced assimilation and boarding school systems of the last century that led to an erasure of languages and cultures, and to recognize that we can also do things to help shine a light on those things, to give back, and that doesn't have to diminish the idea of a holiday where we give thanks and get together with family. So that's just my quick short take on models of reconciliation and peace in terms of moving forward, learning about our own culture and other cultures, and thinking about what it means to be a positive model for cultural learning in this time, in this day and age. So if you like this, I hope you'll subscribe, hit like, and maybe even forward this to someone else. Thank you.